All right, cool. So thanks everyone for coming to the Zoom meeting. We'll be talking about the BrainLM paper. Before we get started, for anyone who is new to these meetings, I'm going to just drop some links in the Zoom chat. This is a journal club associated with medARC, which is like a nonprofit research organization where we do cool neuroimaging projects. And so if you're interested to learn more, those are the links. We're supported by Stability AI, and some of the projects we're doing are, related to the kind of stuff that we'll be talking about today. So today we'll be talking about the BrainLM paper, and more specifically, Connor here will guide us through it. Just to say that I hope that we can have kind of an open discussion. So like, if you have questions or clarifications, I think it's best to just interrupt whenever. So, type any questions or comments you have in the Zoom chat, or you can feel free to enable your mic and just talk freely. So don't worry about making interruptions. So Connor Lane here is a scientific software developer and computational neuroscientist at Child Mind Institute, and it has prepared some slides for us, so that's great. And you can take it away, Connor.
Cool. Yeah, the slides are pretty light, especially just copy paste each figure into the slides, but with a couple extra comments and stuff like that. So we'll go through the slides, but we can also flip back to the paper. And definitely just want to emphasize, everyone, please jump in at any time. I will try to make this informal and just like a conversation about this paper. So to start things off, this is the BrainLM paper, a foundation model for brain activity recordings. We saw this paper come across Twitter, I guess it was a week or two ago. And instantly, I think we all saw the incredible relevance to what we're working on, and just really excited about this work. And I know me personally, I love this idea. It's kind of why I got interested again in brain imaging, was to apply machine learning, advanced machine learning methods to these large scale brain imaging data sets that are out now. So I was super excited by this work. And in general, I really love the foundation of this work, and I think it's very promising. My overall impression of this paper is it's clearly a preprint, and there's a lot they're doing well and nicely. And there's also, I think, things that are obvious to improve on that I'm sure they're working on. And so we'll go through both of those aspects and also talk about how their approach to doing the foundation model contrasts with what we've been thinking about on the foundation model project, and then discuss some of their results. Okay. And for anyone that needs the links, there's some links down here for the papers. I can copy paste into the chat if we need to. All right.
I'll go ahead and copy and paste those in.
Yeah, cool. Okay, so I think let's just jump into discussing the model architecture. At a high level, this paper is about training a large foundation model. A foundation model is just a very large deep network trained on a vast amount of data, typically using some self-supervised paradigm for the training. I'm going to assume that we're all pretty comfortable with those ideas. And if we need to go into the background on that stuff, we can, but for now, we can just go with that as the assumed background and talk about what their specific model approach was. So basically, their model is a fairly typical transformer encoder decoder. So you're feeding in these fMRI sequence data to the transformer, you're masking some patches, and then you're trying to reconstruct the patches. And this is a pretty typical BERT, masked autoencoder, or just more generally masked modeling type setup. And then what's interesting about it to me is how they specifically went about structuring the data and defining what the sequences are and how exactly to go about constructing the patches, which I think is sort of unique. So the way they do that is, you're given fMRI data. It's like a movie of brain activity. At every time step, you collect a full volume of functional brain activity data, and you're collecting these at like once every second or so. So you got a movie of brain activity data, and they go from that to their input sequences by first parcellating each time step. So they use a parcellation, like a set of ROIs, set of regions of interest, taken from the literature. They use the AAL atlas, and so for each region in the atlas, they compute the average activity within that region, and then concatenate these into a vector of 424 activity values, one per region. And so at every time step, they have one of these activity vectors, and the overall input to the model is a sequence of 200 time steps. So the overall input size is 424 by 200. And then the next interesting step is they patchify these inputs into temporal segments that are 20 segments long. So basically the analog of the token or of the patch in this context is a segment of 20 time steps within a single parcel. And so to me, the main difference then is that they're doing this purely temporal based patching compared to maybe a spatiotemporal tube or movie patch that we might be familiar with from like the video MAE type work that we've discussed previously. So I just want to pause here and see if that explanation was more or less clear, and if there are any thoughts related to this approach of using purely temporal patches that are extracted from a parcellation.
Can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, I guess one question I have. So for the temporal only approach, it would obviously be a lot cheaper computationally.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
But what's the difference, I guess, between the types of tasks, downstream tasks that you can do with the temporal compared to the spatiotemporal? Because my guess is that for the spatiotemporal, there is probably a lot more tasks that you can do. Yeah, and then we comparing the performance, I guess, on some tasks like the retrieval that you guys did on MindEye, when training only on the temporal compared to the spatiotemporal, I guess would be interesting.
Yeah. First point you raised, I think, is interesting in terms of the difference in what you can do with a model of this kind. Like basically in the input step, you're reducing your data, you're averaging within each parcel. And so that definitely limits what you can do in the downstream. Like for example, you have no real chance of reconstructing the full resolution spatiotemporal time series because you've averaged at the input step. But aside from that, like the key applications that they consider, predicting clinical variables of interest, or like modeling this reduced time series, you can do that still pretty well. I think the clinical prediction is the most like interesting and important application that can be imagined at this point. And you can definitely do that with this reduced time series in principle. In practice, if it works as well, is probably the open question. While I'm saying that, I'm also thinking that, MindEye and, related projects are pretty focused on, like, in some sense, like mind reading, reconstructing the input that the subject is observing from their brain activity, And it definitely would be surprising to me if you could reconstruct that sort of high resolution, high fidelity input from this reduced activity signal. And yeah, so it definitely just seems like you're trading computational costs for input richness and possibly losing some important information in the process.
Yeah,
yeah.
averaging for every parcel seems like you'd lose a ton of information. I'm surprised that they averaged and didn't like learn a transform or something.
Yeah, that's totally true. Like, really, there's no. It's basically like you're constraining your embedding, your linear embedding weights in such a way that you're just deciding to ignore a lot of information. And if instead they just made a tiny change to the linear embedding, like feed in the full dimension, like spatiotemporal patch, and still project it to the same latent dimension of the model, everything following that could be kept exactly the same, and you'd be giving your model much more information. The only argument I can imagine is that, when you process your data in this way, when you reduce the dimension by averaging within each parcel, your data is much smaller. You can get the data loading much faster. It's much more manageable on disk. All those kinds of basic logistical issues are much easier, but you definitely lose out on a lot of information. And there's maybe also some nuance with getting parcels of different sizes into the model, into a fixed dimension vector, like dealing with the different size parcels. I've kind of struggled with this and resorted to using parcels that are basically regular square patches. And I think averaging is one way to deal with that, kind of a crude way, but it's another way. But yeah, so I think this this
Also,
decision. Yeah, go ahead.
is the AAL atlas? I never heard of that atlas before. Is that like a functional atlas or
No, it's
structural?
yeah,
It's anatomical.
Okay.
yeah, anatomical.
It's a very crude, basically lobes and yeah, some anatomical division.
Yeah, so I was kind of surprised at that choice. I feel like parcellations I see used more often are like the Schaefer functional based parcellations. And so AAL is kind of a surprising choice. But to some degree, I'm not convinced there's huge differences between the parcellation that you choose. Eventually, everyone's, functional topography is a bit different, and you can't capture it too well when you use a shared parcellation across subjects. Okay. Yeah, so that's the model, the general like model architecture framework. One extra detail I didn't touch on is they employ two different masking strategies. One is random masking, like in MAE or BERT, and another one is where you just mask the future time steps. And so this is sort of reminiscent of a GPT like setup, autoregressive setup, except there's no autoregression. You're predicting the next time step as well as the next 2, 3, 4, however many future time steps you mask. You're trying to predict them all at once as opposed to step by step. But we've seen different masking approaches used in like the video MAE works. And so this is kind of just another variation on that. You can always try different masking strategies, and they consider these two. And they also
So they use both of them? Or
yeah, I think they train with both interchangeably, but it wasn't super clear to me whether they train two model variants, in which case I don't know really which one they report on, or they train jointly with each of these strategies, maybe like flipping a coin.
yeah, like the diagram has them both happening I guess maybe it's like concatenation or alternating. So you think it's like alternating maybe?
I really don't know. It wasn't super clear.
It would be kind of, it wouldn't make sense to concatenate because like you're masking stuff that's then unmasked in the other one. So it must
Yeah.
be some sort of mixed training.
Yeah. It's definitely not obvious to me. In general, the paper is a little light on details. Code's not yet available, and there isn't yet like a detailed supplement to go into. So I think questions like this would probably be resolved later on. And yeah, I'm not sure, but they have some results a bit later where they show performance on, predicting future time steps. And it could be in that context that they do some training or fine tuning with this future masking strategy. Okay, so.
Oh, you got a question in the chat.
Yeah, so there's a question about pre-processing. What sort of pre-processing do they do on the functional time series? Most of all the basic stuff that you mentioned, motion correction, normalization to the template, stuff like that. It's in one of the, they discuss it very briefly in the paper. We parse layer the data into 424 regions. Okay. All recordings underwent standard preprocessing, including motion correction, normalization, temporal filtering, ICA denoising. And they cite a couple of references. What do they use? Yeah, these are just references for the ICA denoising. So they're kind of light on the details of what preprocessing they apply. They don't make the preprocessed data available, which honestly, I'm waiting for someone to release preprocess ABCD, UK biobank data. That'd be really convenient because everyone redoing this preprocessing each time they want to build a model on this data is very repetitive. Yeah. Okay. So moving on quickly to some like just numbers and figures on what sort of training they did. So the input data set included 40,000 subjects, 61,000 like scans or recordings, totaling 6,700 hours. It comes out to about 10 minutes of data per subject. That isn't a ton of data per subject, so it's very much, sampling many subjects with not very much data as opposed to some other studies. For example, natural scenes data set, which has just 8 subjects and each one sampled for many, many hours. So it's completely the other end of the spectrum as far as that trade-off goes. Already discussed the parcellation. This temporal patch size is 20 time steps, and the input is like the context window is 10 time steps. So the overall sequence length of a given input is this 424 parcels by 10 of these time segments. So the overall sequence length of around 4,000 is pretty large. That's kind of, it gets to be computationally intensive to do that definitely with the classic attention, flash attention, probably handles it fine. But 4,000 sequence length seems fairly long to me. Overall, they have 120,000 samples and 509 million tokens. This is kind of on the order of magnitude as you would get in ImageNet when you train a vision transformer. So it's definitely a substantial data set. On the other hand, the model size seems very small to me. So depth with 2 attention heads per self-attention layer. The embedding dimension is 512, which at the same time is pretty large. So the model is at the same time kind of imbalanced in terms of dimension versus the depth and the number of heads. Usually people balance these things differently. But overall, the model being only 4 layers deep seemed quite small for this data set. I think like a base vision transformer, I can't remember off the top of my head, 12, or I think it's 12 layers deep, or like 12 blocks. Does anyone remember how deep the base VIT is? Yeah, 12. Okay, so kind of a small model, but the data set is large. And this is one thing that they answered in the feedback they got on Twitter, is that they're currently training a larger model. Okay. So we can get into some discussion of the results. First, like baseline result to look at is just their masked prediction performance on held out data. And so this table shows this masked performance on like the in-domain data set of UK biobanks. This is like a held out validation split, as well as a totally different data set, the Human Connectome project data. And so this is sort of testing a little bit of out of domain, or like, you know, cross sample generalization of the model. And in this table, you have like two major columns, the masking ratio of 0.75 and masking ratio of 0.9. These are different masking ratios used during training. And then you also have two data set sizes, 1% and 100%, training on 1% of the data. And then on the rows, you have different evaluation settings, 3 masking ratios for the UK Biobank, and then 1 masking ratio, 20% for the Human Connectome. And so looking at this table, a couple of things that stood out to me was first, like comparing the performance, the masked performance on the two dataset sizes, 1% versus 100%. The drop in performance for 1% of the data is only like a 10% relative drop, 0.36 versus 0.4. That seemed like not a huge drop from losing 99% of the data. And you can kind of compare that with the drop in performance when moving from one data set to another. From UK Biobank to HCP, it goes from 0.4 to 0.32 about. So you're losing much more performance from going from one data set to another than from shrinking your training data set by 99%. This seemed kind of surprising to me. Like 1% of the data is only like a couple thousand samples.
Does that indicate that the task is easy? Or
yeah, it could be that the task is easy, or like the level at which they're performing it can be reached fairly quickly. And that, you know, yeah, it's hard to know. You know,
maybe the model is just too small.
Yeah, the model is small. It could be that they're not doing that well on the task, and that you need to kind of iterate more, train longer, bigger model, do something in order to really get the benefit of the large amount of data.
I have a general question, which is, I
Mhm.
guess, when you reduce the training data, are there like strategies of choosing what data to drop so that even on less amount of data, you end up training better? Like having samples that cover a broad range of cases?
Yeah, that's definitely a really sensible idea. It's something people research in the context of active learning, you know, trying to select a subset of your data in a smart way so that you can get the same benefit of training on a large data set on a small data set. That's not something they consider here, but in general, that's like a, you know, a very sensible and interesting thing that people research. And I know that we've also discussed active learning strategies as a way to you know, as a way to improve our model performance and, you know, train more efficiently. I'm not quite sure what the status of our active learning directions are currently, but I know it's been discussed in the past. But yeah, so there's
Pretty
okay, go ahead.
weird that the 1% of the data is like doing so good, and it makes me wonder, like, yeah, the model might not be big enough, but also like this is R squared predicting the average activity in each parcel, right? Is that right?
Yeah, good question. Let me go back.
I like
Cut off the. It might be R squared or it might be MSE. Yeah, R squared.
average R squared performance across all the parcels, I guess.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But like it's an easier task because it's averaging across all these parcels. I wonder, like, what if you just build a simple, like a really simple non-foundation model kind of thing?
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
might be able to get really good performance because just the task is maybe easy.
Yeah. I totally agree. That's something that I felt like was kind of missing through most of the evaluations is just some sampling of pretty naive baselines that you can then judge. Like, how hard is this task really? How good is the model doing really? Like, you can reconstruct, you know, missing patches with PCA or with, you know, classic matrix completion type strategies, something simple, something like linear. I would want to see what the performance is in that case so that we could know, are we getting a lot of benefits from having a complex model, from leveraging all this data, or are we not, you know, squeezing all the juice that's available? So yeah, I would
Yeah.
love to see this table with a simple baseline.
Yeah, and I don't know, maybe we'll talk about this later, or it's up to you, but like how useful even is a foundation model where you're limited to averaged parcels like this?
Yeah. Yeah, you're not giving it a ton of signal to work with. And so it's definitely an empirical question. Like, are you giving it enough for your downstream task of interest? Like, I'd be surprised if it was enough for a mind eye, like, you know, image reconstruction
I
task.
mean, it almost certainly wouldn't be enough, right?
I don't
Like
think it would be. I'd be very surprised if it was.
you're not trying to like retain any sort of, or maybe I'm wrong, but are you able to retain fine-grained signal within parcels
Yeah,
if
no,
the
you're
model is
completely.
trained with average parcel data?
No, yeah, you certainly can't. You're definitely averaging over like the high dimensional pattern within each parcel, and we think that stuff is meaningful. That's why we go about the trouble of collecting data with good resolution, and it's proven to be carrying signal, like most recently in things like Algonauts, but for a long time in the history of, you know, multivariate pattern analysis type studies within fMRI. So to throw away that high resolution information, you're definitely losing.
Do we know approximately, I'm reading Jonathan's question here, approximately how many voxels would be in a parcel?
Okay. I think a super rough, I don't know, but a
Or is
rough
it like,
guess would be maybe 1,000. If you think there are like roughly 30,000 voxels, and 424 parcels. I'm not doing the math very well, but whatever that is.
Would
70?
it depend on the brain region? Like each, I mean, maybe definitely my understanding is not uh, complete. But wouldn't the number of voxels in a parcel depend on the region?
Yeah, for
The
sure it would. For sure it would. Some will be larger, some will be small. I think it'd be roughly on the order of 100. Probably not
I see.
1,000, probably not
But
10.
it will vary in terms of order of magnitude, right? It would be
Yeah.
like some are 200, some are 500, something like that, roughly.
Yeah, it would vary a little bit. Generally, I think the people who construct these parcellations try to keep them roughly about the same size, like not have huge order magnitude differences. So we could look into it afterwards, or someone can look into it now while we're talking, but I think it could be roughly about 100 voxels per ROI.
Are there only 30,000 voxels in a brain?
Yeah, that I use that as the benchmark because that's the resolution of the HCP 2mm surface. It has 32,000 vertices, and that's roughly like how many.
Vertex is not a voxel. So.
Right. Yeah. So, but you know, the 2 I think of anyway. Yeah, you could go up or down maybe by a factor of 2 or 4, but I think roughly on the order of 30,000 independent measurements of data is what you get, and you're parcellating it into 424 regions. So you have something like 100 values.
In any case, I don't think it's necessarily not having fine-grained information per parcel, but to be an optimist, you can still do a lot of cool functional connectivity stuff with that, probably.
Yeah. So I think like this type of model shouldn't go away. It's still useful, but it definitely shouldn't be the only one. I think using models that capture the high resolution signal is something we should also be doing.
But it should be all right.
Okay.
Normally they not know that.
Okay. Go on to another result, which is the result on predicting the clinical variables. So these data sets like UK Biobank, they have brain imaging data. They also have lots of behavioral clinical data associated with each subject, like their scores on various surveys, like, psychiatric type surveys, as well as basic demographic data like age and gender and stuff like that. And so they do a small evaluation of this kind where you leverage the model's intermediate representation to predict some of these variables, subject level variables of interest. So they consider age, a score on a PTSD questionnaire, anxiety disorder scale, and a neuroticism scale. In general, so these values are mean squared error, and all of the variables they're trying to predict have been sort of normalized to around the range of 0 to 1. So like age was z-scored, and the other ones were min-max scaled to 0, 1. So you can roughly think of these as like, mean squared error of 0.4 is like 40% off. You're within like a half standard deviation, something like that. But in general, I find these values not super easy to interpret, and I think R squared would have been easier to interpret, so that you don't have to deal with trying to think through what the units of these different measures are. Okay, but in general, what the results show is that compared to the baseline of training SVM on the raw fMRI data, that you get some improvement from using the BrainLM frozen features, and you get some further improvement from using the BrainLM features plus fine tuning. Something like, a 50% improvement in each case, something around that level. So you're not getting 5 times better, but you're making a fairly decent improvement over this raw data prediction baseline.
Yeah, I wish I could interpret these better. Like, is that clinically significant? Like, does the clinician benefit much from whatever 0.018 PTSD score prediction is?
No, I mean, this you know, evaluation setup is always kind of contrived, and it's what we can do now for an evaluation, but really it makes absolutely no sense to try to predict variables like this that you can easily measure with a questionnaire, given how expensive it is to acquire, you know, MRI data. So this is definitely like a contrived kind of a toy task to see if we can predict subject level traits from brain
I
imaging.
guess like if you can strongly correlate their behavioral PTSD, maybe that tells you that you have like other really cool signal that is relevant for symptom diagnosis that you don't get from behavioral.
Yeah, exactly. Like if you can start to relate the brain to behavior, then in time, hopefully you can get even more fine-grained, detailed information about the person's, you know, particular experience that goes deeper than just a score on a scale, like a single number. But things are not there yet, and these errors aren't really, I think, pushing us towards that direction too quickly. Like if you could get, if they were getting R squared 99% on some of this stuff, then that'd be pretty impressive, but this doesn't seem like it's there yet.
Mhm.
The other question I had with this, like even more so than the previous result, is it's really missing a strong baseline. Like there have been many papers over the past 5 or 10 years trying to relate functional brain imaging to behavioral measures. I'm sure other people on the call can weigh in on that, but it's like, you know, people have been working on methods to do this sort of stuff, and they don't use just the raw imaging data. They compute like intermediate features like functional connectivity averaged over, you know, with different parcellations and different pre-processing strategies, and there's like a whole cottage industry for doing this sort of brain behavior type predictions, and they're just kind of you know, this seems to be missing those rows in the evaluation.
Yeah, it makes it really hard to tell if this is like amazing results or worse than other approaches.
Yeah.
Alex is asking a question in the chat. Do we know if the raw data is average parcel values or at the voxel level pre-parcel?
Yeah, I'm pretty sure it's like the input process time series, the same input that goes to the BrainLM. So it's parcellated and pre-processed. Yeah. Yeah, so this is definitely like a work in progress evaluation. It would need some more baselines. It would ideally, I would like to see more measures, like only 4 measures, one of them being age is not super robust evaluation. Another question from this analysis is this is just on UK Biobank behavioral data. HCP also has like a very large set of behavioral measures that they provide, like something like 59 different measures. And so you could do the same evaluation in that context, and it would be more interesting since that is a, you know, a totally different data set collected in a different way, different scanner protocol, different researchers involved. And so it'd be much more like a real world type of test generalizing to a new fMRI data set. So yeah, I think that's another thing that's missing. Let's see if we want to talk about this. Okay, I got like 2 more things to talk about. And then there's one part of the paper that I really didn't understand, and I haven't prepared anything to discuss yet, which is the like this setup, their in silico perturbation. I didn't really understand this, what was going on and what the purpose of it was. And so, but it was interesting. It seemed like one of the most technically interesting parts of the work. And so I don't know if we want to spend some time trying to unpack what was going on here, if anyone else looked at it and thought it was interesting and worth discussing. But I guess just priming that, I'll go back to talking about the last couple of results. Yeah, so the next set of results they report is on this predicting future activity. So like trying to extrapolate out the time series 10, 20, 40 steps into the future. And so a time step here is like 1 second of brain activity recording. So 20 steps, about 20 seconds. And the results are summarized in this table at the top. You have the BrainLM fine-tuned for predicting future activity. I'm pretty sure, if I remember right, that this fine-tuning was using that future masking setup. And then the BrainLM without any pre-training, but fine-tuned for future prediction in the same way. Then they have 3 baselines, predicting future brain activity with LSTM, a neural ODE, and a latent ODE. I'm not super familiar with these ODE models, but it's something for trying to capture a dynamical system in a neural network, I guess. Maybe if anyone is more familiar, they could weigh in on what exactly those do. But regardless of what they do, something I found kind of disappointing with this experiment is that these baselines are very weak. The R² is negative, is basically 0 or negative, and this is worse than just predicting constant zeros. And so with a baseline this week, it's not a meaningful baseline, and so you don't get much out of in the way of understanding if BrainLM is doing a good job or a bad job at predicting future activity.
What is this? Algonauts can be used as a baseline, right?
Okay, yeah, no, it's not a baseline, but I was just commenting on, the R² that they get is 9% at predicting 40 steps in the future. And so we're left to try to figure out, is that a large R²? Is it a small R²? And so I was trying to think of R² numbers that are comparable. And I just remember from Algonauts, the sort of amount of variance you could reasonably explain in Algonauts was about 20% or more for the challenge winner. So I guess probably most people are familiar with Algonauts in this context, but in general, it was a task where you're given an image and you want to predict the brain activity of the person after they were looking at that image. And so going from image to activity, you can explain 20%. And in this context, trying to go from activity at time point X to X plus 20, we're explaining 9%. You're definitely explaining less. Would you expect to explain more? I'm not sure. You're definitely not crushing future time series prediction, but also it seems like a hard task. So,
yeah, I guess if they want to predict future accurately, they would choose a different task. Because if you just use MSE, the outputs many steps in the future will be over smoothed.
yeah, that's a really good point. And I feel like similar observations have been made in the context of trying to predict future video frames. After you get past a certain number of frames, you just predict a super blurry image because you have no information. You kind of just predict the average image.
So I wonder if they use VQVAE on the parcels individually. I think that would work better, and something like low likelihood for the evaluation matrix.
Yeah, I'm not familiar enough with the VQVAE and what would be at a high level, what would be the main difference in the training task?
First they would try to compress individual parcels by turning them into discrete tokens. Then it's just next token prediction on tokens.
Okay, so it'd be like a more discretized and you're trying to, would it be kind of like how GPT predicts the next token in a discrete way as a like a classification?
Yeah, I guess. Or like
That's-
$1.
Yeah. But yeah, when you try to predict future states with mean squared error, you're not giving any way to kind of represent your uncertainty over future states. And so you're kind of forced to just predict the average. You're not able to
Yeah,
reflect
true.
that you have a wide
Well,
variance.
they could do diffusion.
Yeah. Yeah, diffusion would make sense too. Yeah, so in general, this kind of future prediction, it's hard to do it well in this case because, 20 steps into the future, you should have a lot of uncertainty about what the future activity will look like. It doesn't seem like they're doing that well, and they don't have a very compelling baseline to compare with.
Did you say the task is resting, just resting?
They definitely have task and resting state data in the data set, and as far as I can tell, they don't distinguish when they describe their
It's
training
like
set.
I imagine that like resting, there's not going to be that much fluctuation over time, like doing nothing for a minute.
Yeah, or there will be slow oscillations that maybe you can pick up on.
Yeah. And Alex says in the chat, like the comparison with Argonauts is maybe unfair because like using GLM single betas instead of average parcels.
Yeah, very good point. Really good point. As I could just delete this. I'm not married to it at all. I don't think it's a close comparison, but I was just trying to get some frame of reference in my head for like how much variance should we be expecting ideally to explain. I think if it was 20%, we'd be very pleased. And this 9% in that context seems pretty large. And I'm wondering what's going on with
Right.
that.
At the same time, though, like if you're averaging across a lot of voxels, the signal is a bit easier maybe to predict because you're, averaging cleans up the data, like smooths the data in a way. So
Yep, that's a good point also. So I think like that's a good point raised that Algonauts is not a fair comparison. I totally take that point. And I think the takeaway for me from this is it's not clear to me how to interpret their 9% R squared.
yeah, at the very least, baselines that are 0 or negative are not informative.
Yeah, not super informative. Okay. Yeah, the other thing I noticed in this, looking at the figure, not just the table reports for prediction, like I think 40 steps into the future, but the figure shows a little bit of prediction error kind of saturating after about 5 or 6 steps. So if you just look at the red bar, after 1 step, the error is, smallish. It increases a bit up to after 6 steps, then it's kind of flat. It doesn't change much more. So intuitively looking at that, I might be tempted to say you're predicting something up to 6 steps, and then past 6 steps, you're just predicting some kind of average pattern. And whatever variance explained you get is just from that stable average pattern.
And what is the conclusion that the authors make on this? Like, do they conclude like, yeah, we can predict the future kind of, or did they say something else?
I don't think they say too strongly. Model achieves high accuracy in reconstructing mouse brain activity sequences. No.
Okay, so they're just kind of like doing a bunch of exploratory analyses in a way.
Yeah. Forecast next 20 time steps.
And I guess it is still a good comparison to like at least showing the fine tune versus without pre-training, showing fine tuning helps.
Yeah, fine tuning definitely helps. Yeah, you get basically all the prediction from the fine tuning. Actually, no, they don't. This is without pre-training, so they don't have the comparison with no fine tuning and pre-trained
Oh,
only.
wait, what is without pre-training then?
So I guess that's a BrainLM trained from scratch without using the pre-trained weights. And so this is showing you're definitely getting a benefit from initializing with the pre-trained weights, but you don't have the opposite comparison of what prediction can you get without the fine tuning.
But fine tuning in this context means fine tuning on what?
Fine tuning on this future activity prediction.
Oh, so using training data that has like the paired future time points to help
Yeah,
fine tune it?
my assumption is this future masking like branch of the setup is their future prediction fine tuning setup.
Oh, so maybe that's why they have the two diagrams, is what you're saying.
Yeah, that's my guess.
Mm.
It might be in the paper and I missed it, but my guess from the reading that I got was during pre-training they used this branch with a random masking strategy, and during fine-tuning for this experiment they do future masking. Yeah. Okay. All right. So predicting the future activity, they're getting some R-squared, 9%. That's something, and it's hard to tell if that is really good or not so good. It's hard to tell. But they're predicting something for sure. Okay, last thing to look at is this attention map analysis. And so this one I found kind of probably the most fuzzy, like, well, I don't know. I didn't really know what to make sense of this. Let me just talk you through what it shows though. So each plot here shows the attention weight for the attention map from the class token. So as is typical, these sequences are prepended with a class token, and this is like a learnable token that is often used to kind of pool information across the entire sequence. And so like when you train a VIT to do ImageNet classification, you usually classify off of the class token representation. So it's just an extra path to usually pool information across the entire network. So this is showing the attention maps, average attention maps across all the data for this class token. And it's trying to make the point that there are some differences between different task states, or like these attention maps distinguish between on the top row, different task states, and then on the bottom row, different, subject level variables, like different scores on a depression index. And so like, the patterns are a little bit hard to make out. Each dot represents one parcel. They're kind of embedded in 2D in a way that isn't super clear. The mapping is given in this B panel, where each dot is colored according to which network it belongs to. You have visual cortex regions at the bottom, and it's in some, I guess, sensory motor regions in the middle, and then most other things are interspersed. So it's kind of like they took the 3D coordinates of each parcel and kind of flattened it along the Z dimension to get this embedding. So this embedding is kind of mixed, but a point that you can start to make out is that there are some visual differences between, say, the task attention map and the resting attention map, and the low versus high depression attention maps. Some visual differences, but not super obvious what they are.
Aren't attention maps done really differently in Dino V2? It's
Yeah,
not just
totally.
the CLS token.
No, I think I put that there as another like a very rough, hazy comparison, but I brought it up just because like the Dino V2 is an example of an amazing attention map visualization. It looks amazing. It's very clear, shows you something interesting about what the model is doing. It's the best case of doing a good attention map visualization. If anyone's not familiar, for some reason my keyboard is not listening. But yeah, DynoV2, it's like you might have seen it on Twitter where you see the little dog running through the field and the attention map completely picks out the dog and all of its, you know, moving paws and whatever, enough to even like distinguish different, you know, parts like the face from the tail or whatever. So it's a very clear usage of the attention maps to tell you something interesting. Whereas this is much noisier, you know, less clear what's going on. You're kind of forced to read some tea leaves. So it's not hitting the point in a super obvious way. The other question I had about this is, you know, they hadn't mentioned the class token up to this point. It's not clear to me how the class token is even being optimized. You know, how the path through the model that starts with the class token, what does that even learn? It's not like in the vision transformer where the class token learns, you know, it's trained in the vision transformer, the class token is trained to predict the final classification target. So it's obvious that the class token should learn a pooled representation. But in this case, the class token, I'm not sure if it was being used at all. So you wouldn't really expect the class token attention weights to give you anything meaningful by default.
Yeah, I agree. It doesn't really make sense. You should just use like all of the embeddings at a certain layer or something.
Yeah, you have to analyze the attention maps at each token in this sort of modeling setup in order to get anything meaningful out of the attention maps, I feel like. Yeah, so in general, I think attention map analysis and visualization is one of the great things you can do with these transformer models. You can get a lot of insight from studying attention maps, and I think going forward, we'll be able to get insight from looking at attention maps for foundation models trained on brain imaging, but I think this isn't quite there yet.
I mean, obviously there are visual differences, which I guess generally speaking shows that the model has learned to differently represent different states, but I'm not sure. And I guess maybe you can kind of localize to what areas of the brain are like more so important for those states, I guess.
Yeah.
But beyond that, it doesn't seem like it would be that informative.
Yeah. I also think like once you get to the point where you're comparing these kind of, you know, visual maps, like a visual map for task versus resting and a visual map for low versus high depression, you should also compare with like the classic brain maps, you know, generated in the classic sort of way. Like, you know, just compute the resting state networks and compute the task functional connectivity networks and visualize them side by side. Those visualizations are classic, very well done, and usually pretty clear in demonstrating the pattern. So, you know, if we're just at the end of the day getting a visualization that's very analogous to those through this, you know, pretty complex roundabout way through going through a foundation model, getting the attention maps and just plotting them back on the brain to visualize task versus resting differences. It's pretty roundabout and involved. So I think there's more to think about in terms of how to best leverage and analyze the attention weights to get insight.
Mm-hmm. I can briefly mention some stuff about the in silico
Yeah, that'd be great.
perturbation.
Yeah,
Because I think that that is actually a really cool approach
it
to
is. Yeah,
use
I
with
thought it was cool
this.
too.
So I think as an example, maybe in the brain diffuser paper, like Urslick's fMRI to image paper, what you could do is like you can take you can take an input and you can just like an input being the brain, and you can artificially like instead of giving it the model real brain data, you give it fake brain data, and then you see what kind of images it makes, right? So you pre-train the model on real data so that it can do the task, and then you take fake data and maybe like you put zeros everywhere in the brain except for fusiform face area. and then you put that into the model, and then the output is faces. And it's like, okay, so the model has this like representation where we can like manipulate different parts of the volume and see what it seems to be preferential towards, like especially functional organization kind of stuff like that. So I think it's a similar approach with this, where you can take the pre-trained BrainLM model and you can artificially like tweak the parcels and see how tweaking like one parcel affects all the other parcels. So in that sense, you can like kind of gauge the maybe sort of relationships or causal relations or something, where like how does one affect the other kind of thing. And I think they also do that with like resting state versus task. And they show that like, I guess they show that like visual cortex is very susceptible to perturbations in a way that interacts with resting versus task. So I think it's cool. I'm not quite sure. I think there's a lot of potential there, although I'm having a bit of difficulty imagining the exact kind of research questions that you could do out of that. But you know, the idea that you're basically having a synthetic brain model, and so you can just like do all sorts of stuff with it and see what the outputs look like.
Yeah. At a high level, I really love that idea, and I think there's a ton of potential to explore different directions around like what can you do with a generative, just a simulator for functional brain activity or generative model for functional brain activity. I'm sure you can do lots of things, especially along the lines of like perturbing a prefix input or perturbing a prompt, or choosing a particular like activity prompt and then seeing how the model completes the sequence and trying to make some insights or inferences from that pattern. And I think like this is probably one attempt at doing something cool with that. And it's probably not the final version of what you can do, and there's still a lot to figure out on that front. Like my question with this is, so like if you just look at this setup, you have some input sequence, you optimize over the perturbation to get an intermediate sequence, you pass it through the BrainLM, and the optimization is designed to make the BrainLM output similar to the target. But like if the optimization does a good job, won't it just make this perturbed sequence identical to the target, and the BrainLM intermediate is just like an unnecessary step in the middle? Yeah, I just think like I don't fully get the rationale and what exactly is going on.
So I guess it's like, what can you do to make it such that parcel A is maximally responsive, right? Like that's the goal. Like a desired brain state can be, I guess, a given parcel output.
Yeah.
So it's like you can keep making tweaks to the model until you, through gradient descent, find the weights that lead to the parcels being maximized or something.
Yeah. But it's like this G function, which optimizes over the perturbation, seems to be able to make arbitrary changes to the input. And so like whatever pattern you want to see in the output, G should be capable of just constructing that perturbation to match it identically.
Well, yeah, but it's you're confined to the minimal changes that you make to the weights of the model, I guess.
Yeah. Well, I probably shouldn't talk too much about this because I don't understand it fully.
Neither do I. I didn't read it that closely.
But it's definitely interesting, and it seems like one of the most interesting parts of the paper, and probably like to understand it better.
Hey, Paul, hey, Gordon.
Hey.
Yeah, I think a good analogy here would be like prefix fine-tuning in language model. So basically, you will have a small number of parameters to tune. So I think this is for like fine-tuning, right? Or you already have this BrainLM and you want to adapt to the downstream sort of data, right?
I'm not sure if that's what the silico perturbation part is it?
Yeah, because for the pre-training, you definitely don't need that. I guess the point is you want to adapt to some distribution shift, right? So yeah, so basically it says it's a prompting. So I guess standard way to do it in like language modeling is that you add another token, which you
Right.
tune the input of the token. I think it will be sort of similar here. Like if you think the input after the first layer with the extra token, it also is doing some sort of G on top of the input, right? So I'm not sure, like maybe they should just do a simple comparison based on that. It feels to me that it's just some parameter efficient fine-tuning.
Mm.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I missed the first half. Yeah, hopefully, I read some part of the paper. Basically, I guess the difference between our framework is that they have longer sequence lengths, right? And they sort of get the minimum embedding, like minimal data needed for each time slices, so they can fit in a lot, along like 20 times, 200 times.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess in order to fairly compare our framework to their framework, sort of hypothetically, the question is, what's the information there? Is the information lies inside those puzzles? Like, does the like the pixels inside the puzzles really important, or like information really contains along the changes across time? Right. So we're basically missing the time information a lot because our time interval is sort of small. But they are definitely missing the part that those information inside the puzzles, they basically just average it or somehow extract those.
Yeah, I feel like, in terms of comparing foundation models, like what's the best way to compare foundation models? Probably compare performance on a downstream task, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
So like what is the appropriate downstream task for brain foundation models?
Yeah.
I guess it also kind of depends on the goals, right? Like this paper is more focused on
Definitely.
clinical predictors, like PTSD score. And we've not really been trying to do that. We've been trying to do downstream of like image retrieval and reconstruction. So like that changes how we even think about building the model in the first place.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's true. So I guess for our purpose of image retrieval, we don't really need like a long slice of time, because like if you see an image a minute ago, like you definitely if you're looking at other stuff, then you basically forget about the image. I would say.
Well, I don't know though. The Algonauts paper showed some long time course signal.
Oh, really?
Yeah, it was like using the past 2 minutes of data as additional conditioning to predict the current sample was very helpful in the Algonauts paper that Hughes got first place for. So I think actually people are underestimating the time dependencies of how the brain works.
I see. So basically, even I see the blood will retain in those voxels, like for quite a long time, or
Well, I mean, for if you like look at something like the voxels that are sensitive to it will follow the like exaggerated hemodynamic response function. It's like 20 seconds total, but I'm talking about beyond that, like the patterns amongst voxels maybe have a longer temporal dependency that you could that is maybe not really easy to figure out, but you can learn these subtle dependencies with these kind of modeling.
I see. I guess it relates to how brain actually function. Like I know there's a short-term memory that you can basically remember everything. Let's say 10 minutes ago, something.
Yeah, you know,
So
people's representations of stuff are biased by their experience, and experience is undefined in time. So I guess, well, you know, it depends on the task and everything, but there's probably subtle interactions, hippocampus to cortex, etc., that are like beyond just a single sample of like looking at something.
I see. And also depends on how you do how you show those images when the subjects get scanned, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So what's the typical process for that?
For what?
Like how do you do the experiments? Like how do you get the image and the fMRI pair?
I'm not, like, what do you show to the person, or how do you pre-process
Yeah.
it?
How do you show those images to the person? Like
Those, it's just like put them in the scanner, have them fixate in the center of the screen, and then show images one at a time.
and I see. So but like what will be the frequency of like the image switching?
It depends. The natural scenes data set that we've been talking about and using is 3 seconds on, 1 second off.
Oh, I see. Interesting. That's pretty short time actually.
It's
Yeah.
a lot longer than EEG studies use.
Yeah, 3 seconds to look at the image is a long time.
I see. Cool. Very interesting.
So anyway, Connor, do you want to wrap up? Like, what are your like ending impressions of this paper?
Yeah, I think my closing impression of the paper is that I think you know, I love the idea. I think the approach is interesting and different from, you know, what we've been considering and what has been considered before for the most part. The main difference being, like Dingling was just discussing, you know, they have a long time window, and to compensate, they average over the spatial dimensions within each parcel, whereas we're preserving the spatial dimension and we have a shorter time window. And I think, you know, this is an interesting difference, and it really remains to be seen, like which approach is better in what context. And I feel like one takeaway I have from this work is we really, as like a small community, it'd be nice to start getting some reliable benchmarks that we can compare these foundation models on, like something akin to ImageNet, where we can start to actually compare models head to head in a reasonable, like competitive sort of way, like a fair comparison sort of way. And so in general, I felt like the benchmarks and comparisons are somewhat weak in this paper, and that's the biggest thing that stands out. Is what's needed for the future is just, you know, strong, fair comparisons between models.
You have an idea of maybe like what would be the best kind of, what would
Yeah.
be the equivalent of an ImageNet classification for brains? Is it like R squared 10 seconds in the future or something?
I don't know. I don't love, like, I would like to predict something downstream and independent. Like, the worry I always have with predicting the brain activity itself is if you're just picking up on the inherent smoothness properties of the data, you might not be reading any important information out from the data. And so in that way, I like MindEye and these sort of image reconstruction approaches. But I also think, like, to be super naive about it, why not just do ImageNet, basically? Like, why not just do image classification from natural scenes dataset brain activity images? Or why not just do object segmentation from natural scenes dataset brain activity maps? Like, these are well-defined quantitative tasks that have been, you know, studied for a long time in computer vision. You can do, you know, we know the metrics, we know how to compare models on these sorts of tasks. We could just have a papers with code benchmark for natural scenes dataset object classification, object detection, object segmentation. So that's my initial idea. You can also do, like, maybe similarity with, yeah, I think a lot of benchmarks are possible on the natural scenes data set, and it's much harder to do good benchmarks on data sets where you have not as much information about the stimulus that was presented. Like,
Yeah,
you can do
I
lots
think
of natural scenes.
like that sounds totally reasonable to me. I guess the only counter argument to that is like you're prioritizing foundation models for, you know, vision and for a specific data set that is not a usual data set. It's like 7 Tesla, really high quality data. But you know, you got to start somewhere, right? Like, and you got to pick a data set. So like out of all the data sets available that are task-based, for which it has to be task-based if you're doing a downstream decoding kind of task, then yeah, I think it sounds reasonable. But you know, it's hard to like unite labs and groups, because I imagine, you know, this Yale group is not the only group trying to do this kind of thing. I think there's probably a lot of groups now that are trying to build basically foundation models of fMRI. And so it's difficult, I think, to coordinate how do we have a shared like evaluation metric on this when there's so many different ways you could evaluate clinical outcomes, predicting in time, functional connectivity, visual decoding. Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, there's definitely probably a lot of groups working on this. It's definitely still early stages for this sort of work in this field, this kind of foundation models for fMRI. So we haven't sorted out the benchmarks yet. It's a good point you make about the natural scenes data set being biased to vision. I don't love that. I know there are also data sets like from Alex Huth, their lab, where they have a nice natural scenes like data set, but with auditory stories that are presented. And so that might be more appealing to the natural language speech community.
Yeah.
But
I mean, ideally, the foundation models should be applicable to like all different kinds of tasks. So, you know,
yeah,
maybe like just pick out a couple of different data sets with tasks that could be applied to it or something. It could even be
yeah,
like a library or something, like take the latents from your foundation model and then pipe them through, see how it does on these other data sets or something.
yeah. I think that sounds like the right approach. You have your foundation model. It should be a foundation model you can then evaluate the performance of its features on vision specific tasks and on natural language specific tasks, speech tasks, so forth.
All right. Yeah. Thanks so much for presenting this, Connor. I think you did a great job, and I definitely have a better understanding of this paper now.
Yeah, I really enjoyed going into this paper. I feel like it forced me to look at it more closely than I might have otherwise. I learned a lot from the paper. I really like the paper. I think it's a work in progress, but it'll turn out to be really good work, and I'm super excited about the direction.
I think they must be revising this, making bigger models. Like at this point, it's a work in progress, but I'm excited to see how they expand on things, right?
Yeah, totally.
All right. Thanks, Connor.
Yeah, thanks.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks for sticking around.
Thanks, Connor.
See ya.